Okay, why don't we go ahead? So welcome everybody. My name is Mary Gray and I'm a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research and a member of the AI 100-year study that's based at Stanford University. And you're going to hear a little bit more about that. And I'm gathered here with my colleagues. I'm going to briefly introduce them, so you're going to hear their names several different times. But this is really meant to be a conversation among all of us and a chance for you all to ask us questions about where this conversation of studying AI is going. What's an approach one might take that's meticulous and imagines an arc of time that gives us the luxury of reflecting on where we're going every 5 years. So joining me today, I'm going to read, at least from my left to right on the Zoom screen, Peter Stone, who's the David Brunton Jr. Centennial Professor of Computer Science at the University of Texas at Austin and Executive Director of SoTA AI America. I'm also joined by David Robinson, visiting scientist with the AI Policy and Practice Initiative in the College of Computing and Information Science at Cornell University. Johannes Himmlich. Johannes, please make sure you correct how I said your last name. I'm already blushing with embarrassment. He is currently an assistant professor of public administration and international affairs at Syracuse University. Thomas Arnold, who is a research associate in the Human-Robot Interaction Laboratory at Tufts University. And Dr. Russ Altman, who is the Kenneth Fong Professor of Bioengineering, of Genetics, of Medicine, of Biomedical Data Science, and by courtesy of Computer Science at Stanford University, and probably wins the award for the longest title for today. Thank you all for joining the conversation. And what I'm really looking forward is hearing from each of you. And I want to start out just to get the questions going for this roundtable and for our session, which is thinking about AI futures, a report from the 100-year study of artificial intelligence. Let me start with you, Peter, if you would just give us a little bit of background by way of your connection to AI 100. What is this thing we call AI 100, and what's your connection to it?
Sure, I'll be happy to. Thanks, Mary, and thanks for bringing this together. Hopefully everybody can see my screen now.
Yes.
I actually play a dual role in the 100-year study on artificial intelligence. I was the chair of the first study panel, which produced the report that I hope many of you have heard about from 2016, which is available on our website. And I'm now chair of the standing committee, which is along with Mary and Russ, which has commissioned the next report, which should be coming out in sometime this year, that's being chaired by Michael Littman. And just by very brief introduction, the 100-year study, the goals is to support a longitudinal study of influences of AI advances on people and society, centering on periodic studies of developments, trends, futures, and potential disruptions associated with the developments in machine intelligence, and on formulating assessments, recommendations, and guidance on proactive efforts. So I read that, but it's actually a quote from the charge from the endowment. The endowment is housed at Stanford. The idea is that, and its origins was really the AAAI Silomar study when Eric Horvitz was the president of AAAI. That was sort of where it sort of started getting launched. That was back in 2008, I believe. That's when the ideas started flowing for this. But the endowment came in 2014 or 15. And the idea is that every 5 years, there'll be a persistent sort of standing committee that's in charge of it, but every 5 years, there'll be a study panel that's constituted. And as I said, I was the chair of the study panel that delivered the first report, and then now I'm part of the standing committee. And there's another study panel that's working and that's underway. The idea is to every 5 years give basically a concept from the perspective of AI insiders, people who work closely in the field, on what are the perspectives of AI to sort of counter often the sort of external perceptions, the hype or the that's sometimes positive, sometimes negative, with audience being AI researchers such as yourself, but also the general public, industry, and policymakers. And the first study panel report, which did come out in 2016, the charge was to identify the possible advances in AI over the next 15 years and their potential influences on daily life. And I'm not going to read this whole thing, but it was basically focused on large urban regions, and thinking about, and in the report, we actually looked back 15 years, what had changed and what did we predict. This is the names of the people who were on the study panel, but that really focused in 8 different areas with likely urban impact by 2030. And these are those areas. And so that study panel report, I encourage you, I'm not going to say more about it here, but if you haven't seen it, it did get very good reception, and you can read the whole thing by just going to the web and finding it here. So let me stop my share there and turn it back to you, Mary.
Thanks for giving us that context, because much of this conversation is to really think through the impact of that study, of the panel that you ran, and then to look to the future of the drafting of the next report. And I want to give the attendees a sense of our colleagues here. I'm going to begin with a couple of people representing the study workshops that were commissioned by AI100 to be able to take up and in some ways focus energy for the next study panel. So let me start with Thomas and Johannes. If each of you could just spend a little time, maybe if I could start with the two of you, to talk a bit about what was the motivation behind the study workshop that you convened. Tell us about just the structure of it. What exactly were those workshops? What were the insights that you gained that you'd like to share with our attendees today?
Thanks. Sure. Let me take this from here. So I'm Johannes Himmelreich. I am an assistant professor in Syracuse, and together with a large team a while ago in Stanford, we ran one of those study workshops. I should say the slide deck here is branded with Stanford, but I have no affiliation with Stanford anymore. That's just because that's what we used back then. But I should acknowledge that we got a lot of support, not just from AI100, but also from other centers at Stanford, from the Presence Center and from the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society. This is our whole team. Also to acknowledge that it's just Thomas and me here tonight. The other 4 main organizers are all based in either in British time or in Central European time, and therefore couldn't make it. Now to your question, Mary, what was our motivation? So we were actually talking about tech ethics very generally. That actually came out of an event that we had with Tristan Harris, and different postdocs at Stanford were sitting together and brainstorming and discussing, and we realized that one topic that we're all interested in is the technologization of caregiving. So because we realized there are 2 major social trends that are coming into contact in a significant way. On the one hand, the care gap, so due to mostly the demographics. On the one hand, on the other hand, the rise of AI and the market dynamics that leads to a technologization of care. And we wanted to look into that, and here are actually 3 aims. The central aim was to raise and address the conceptual, ethical, and political issues of intimate AI, or of caring AI, via a multidisciplinary approach. And we had 3 main aims for that. One is that we wanted to get clearer on what the normative and the ethical issues are in this intimate AI, or in this technologization of care. The second aim was to bring theory and practice together, so that we wanted this to be a workshop that's not just interdisciplinary between, say, for example, me as a philosopher with Thomas, who works more in robotics, and also our colleagues in science and technology studies, but also people from the medical school. Startups were there who were showing us the products that they have in development, as well as caregivers attended the workshop. And then we wanted this to have some upshot and to inform debates. Mary, tell me if you want me to talk a bit about to give an example of the structure we had on the first day, or
that would be great.
Yeah, so maybe that brings out how that looked in practice. So our first day was the 28th of May, 2019. And our first exercise was that we wanted everybody who participated, we had about almost 30 participants, to think about the best care they have experienced. So this was really to fix idea of what we mean with care and what experiences we've had with care. To, interactive and personal way, get some idea of what care looks like when it's done well. Just to fix ideas. From this, we developed our concept of care by getting input from feminist sociologists about it. And then is when the interactive or the more practical impetus started. We talked about the circumstances of care. This is where we heard from medical practitioners, but also from care practitioners, so from caregivers, so the people who go into homes and care for people, for in-home caregivers. And we had what we called an innovation fair, where we had startups come in and tell us over lunch about the products they're developing. We had then a discussion with them about how they encode care in technologies, harking back to the concept that we developed, and just to see how they reflect these ideas. And then we had a workshop of how we actually can get care into technology, basically to wrap up the first day. And I think the two parts that I really liked, that stood out for me, and that was our aim as in organizing this, was that we had this practitioner part for care practitioners and the industry part for industry practitioners. That was to serve our game, to serve our aim of bringing theory and practice together. Mary, let me again hear from you. Should we go on to the next speaker? The next would be the three startups that we had, which would maybe give us an idea of what the kind of care products were that we were talking about.
If you could just finish out that structure, and then I would like to switch to David and have him discuss the structure of the study workshop that he convened. And I'm just really curious to hear how these structures compare to each other.
So let's stay with the structure and let's go to David.
Perfect. So David, let me ask you the question I asked of Johannes. Just can you say a bit about the motivation behind your study workshop and the structure that you put together for the event?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for bringing us together and for supporting this work. It's an honor to be here and to see what came out of many of these other efforts. In our case, we noticed many of us had studied or had worked on particular instances in which AI is being deployed now in public sector settings or to do things that are of civic significance. So for instance, in my own case, I have done a significant amount of work on the use of predictive analytics in courtrooms in the United States to predict recidivism and to make decisions about who gets to go home if they're accused of a crime and who gets sent into a cage. In some of the other instances that colleagues have thought about, and not only colleagues at Cornell, but across the field, we've seen some close examination of some other high stakes instances, including in predictive analytics for predicting and addressing risks of child abuse and a number of other settings. And what we noticed was that although there are a number of conversations unfolding, not only in the US, but around the world about how to govern these sorts of applications and how to make sure that the relevant stakeholders understand them and are able to shape their impact. A lot of that discussion is pretty theoretical and is disconnected to a certain extent from the realities of deployment in particular cases. So what we saw was an opportunity to bring some experiences into conversation with each other, people thinking in a more overall or theoretical way about how to govern AI, with a number of people in different areas of application who have in fact deployed or created and have led the use of systems. And so what we did for the workshop was to bring together 4 teams that had created high stakes AI applications that are in the world now. One of the applications was pretrial risk assessment, and we had somebody who works in court systems creating those sorts of algorithms. That was our first. The second was someone from Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, that's Pittsburgh, in the United States, which has a sort of field-leading effort to predict child abuse and neglect using information from all over the county's different data systems. That's a widely studied example, thanks to a lot of the work that they've done to be transparent about what they're doing. A third example was an effort to realign school start times in a large city, Boston, the United States. And fourth and finally, a hospital clinical application to predict the onset of sepsis, which is a sudden and high stakes, often fatal disease that emerges from coordination, often from coordination of care issues in the clinical setting. And so those are four very different problems, but in each instance, what we saw was that there were novel applications of predictive analytics being rolled out to help human decision makers to deal with those problems. And what we thought there was an opportunity to do that hadn't happened very much, or hadn't happened as much as it usefully could thus far, was to really get people to compare notes across those different domains. What challenges did they face, not only in architecting these systems, but in trying to land the plane of actually having this piece of software have the impact in the world that it is intended to have. And so that gets into some human factors issues and some sort of often tricky issues about unanticipated responses by stakeholders to systems, or sometimes people might trust a system rather more than the architects had expected, or perhaps rather less, or they'll disregard sometimes outputs of systems. And so we really wanted to look at those in parallel, and we spent 2 days together in June of 2019. And really each of those four teams was able to give us a more or less candid sort of inside the actor's studio look at what it had been like not only to build, but also to sort of maintain that system and integrate it into the social practice that they were trying to assist.
You know, I feel like it was such a pleasure, and it seems like so long ago to have attended parts of both workshops, study workshops. And I would just love to hear from you all as the conveners. You had an idea of what you might be able to pull out of the collection of actors, as you put it, David, who really have different perspectives on not just building these systems, but the deployment. Can you tell us a little bit about what you took away, kind of moments from those workshops, from the study workshops that really stand out to you, that in some ways maybe bring life to the page of the study panel that AI100 had commissioned? Let me start with you, David.
Sure. So, we had a few things. The one that really stuck with me the most came from the team at Duke Hospital that had been working on this sepsis issue. So their idea was to look at a whole bunch of data to alert clinicians when there was extra hazard of this terrible infection that might be something they would need to address. And as it turned out, there were a whole bunch of complexities that mediated actually trying to make patients safer after they had figured out the statistical model to forecast clinical outcomes, like how were the alerts presented and so on. And they did this deep dive of working alongside and with the people in the hospital. And the phrase that they came up with was, this isn't about deployment, which is this Marshall analogy that's often used, like we're going to force you to use this thing, but really about integration between not only the data model, but the piece of running code that exists and the practices of the people. And so there were all kinds of things like, for instance, it's very different if an alert appears on a screen versus if a critical care nurse calls an attending physician and says, there's some concern about this issue. Even if it's the same issue, very different clinical results. And we saw versions of that same dynamic of the need to understand and to really accommodate how people are, it's not just about correctly understanding the stakeholders, but really the need to accommodate what the technology is doing in a way that's taking notice of and that is responsive to the human side of what's happening. And we saw in some cases success with that. And I think in some other cases, as the people who were there would attest there were difficult lessons learned where, sometimes if you make assumptions about how people are going to use a thing that don't turn out to be true, then aims can be frustrated, or deployments ultimately may not occur in some instances. So that sort of integration, not deployment. I mean, and it implies, that's just a phrase, but it implies, I think, a very different attitude that really is much more respectful of the knowledge and the sort of stature and dignity of the line level people who are often on the receiving end of various kinds of forecasts or predictions. And so when I hear that phrase and when I think about that part of our discussion, the virtue that I think it points to, or the aspiration that it points to, is one of humility. And really of this sense that by being humble about the different kinds of expertise that are necessary in order to have success in an organization, you can really have greater efficacy with AI projects.
That's just a really compelling point. And I mean, I have a memory of during the study workshop, David, where there were different moments where you could tell the folks who were in the thick of building these applications could tell when they were at a distance from who will be impacted, if you will, by what they were building, and when they were face to face with the folks, with the frontline workers. In the case of the sepsis AI, that those were the folks who were going to have to take up and absorb what had been built. So I want to shift this for a second back to Thomas and to Johannes to say, did you see a similar insight around the perhaps a tension between deployment that makes a lot of assumptions about what AI is going to look like when it hits the ground running, and this notion of integration that David is mentioning here?
I can start out on that point. I definitely recognize similar themes there, and I think it is not only about being in the thick of building these systems, but also in the way for our workshop, bringing in entrepreneurs who are actually trying to present a product in a compelling way, and seeing with the questions that came up under discussion, seeing some of those tensions and recognizing what has been considered, what hasn't been considered, recognizing some of the technical achievement, while also knowing that on the ground, there does etymologically and otherwise need to be humility in terms of how care in particular, and here there's kind of some remarkable overlaps with David's remarks. Care, a theme that came out for us was care as a process. And so measuring outcomes for care is a really delicate and interactive affair. And that was certainly a theme over the course of the workshop. Was how exactly do we measure the quality and the quantity of what's being provided from the different perspectives of those who are recipients, those who are giving care, and how many angles that requires for technologists. Johannes, I don't know what you might add to that.
Thanks. Yeah, so David, I very much like the slogan of that we need integration, not deployment. And as Thomas said, we could really see how there's a problem on the side of technologists. For example, right, a technologist will say, well, if we have something here, some care task, say some home visit that usually takes half a day, and we can now do it in 1 hour. That's a good thing, right? That's what technologists think. That's efficiency. This is a product that makes things better. And what that overlooks, of course, is, and we could say that is a lack of humility, that there might be other outcomes that are not as easily measurable. So there's definitely a problem of, let's call it a problem of humility on the technologist side. What I want to add is that there's also a challenge that stands in the way of integration from the, let's call them practitioner side. So from the medical professionals and from the caregivers and from the care professionals. There's a massive, and we could feel it in the workshop, there is a massive reluctance of engaging with technologists in part because of a skepticism and a well-grounded skepticism that the technologies don't really understand the practice of the care work, and that the technology won't be able to do the job. But also there's a reluctance to engage with technology out of a temperament of self-defense, because they're worried that maybe the technologies will take our jobs away. So I think the challenge to integration, which I really like that we need integration, not deployment, is really a challenge that we have from both sides, from the technologist side, but also from the practitioner side. And that's what the workshop very clearly brought out to my mind.
So that's interesting. So in some ways, I'm hearing perhaps a bit of tension between the stakeholders that we might imagine who are at the table, who are trying to bring what might we all assume are improvements that can come through AI. And at the same time, it sounds like each of the study workshops identified places where there might be other sets of priorities that are defining the agenda that perhaps for foundational thinkers, developers, they aren't thinking about those other competing interests. So I'm just wondering if from the representatives from the study workshops, or from Peter and Russ, who absolutely have a perspective on these tensions, did you come to some sense of how to resolve these in multi-stakeholder settings when you're trying to figure out maybe multiple objective functions, how people would sit down and sort through when should optimizing time, efficiency give way to facilitating conversations that might take longer, for example, in a care case? Were there any moments during the study workshops that might give us some guidance on how to navigate balancing these tensions, these different demands on AI?
So I can jump in on that and respond to what Johannes was just saying about the example of someone going quickly and thinking basically that optimal means fast. And one way of looking at it is that the technologists know what is optimal, and the other stakeholders are sources of inconvenient side constraints, I think, is sometimes how it's seen. But I think another way of looking at it, and this was another of the central themes that emerged from our workshop, was that problem discovery and problem definition are a vital step, and they often happen early and they're often poorly documented. But for instance, minimizing cost outlay per visit might be one goal in a care context, but making someone feel cared for or causing a satisfying experience to occur that might be more time consuming might be a very important goal. And just because that goal is perhaps less likely to be top of mind for someone who's looking at the system from a sort of centralized point of view and maybe has a budget spreadsheet in front of them instead of, a soiled, bed cover or something, they may think, okay, it's all about the numbers. But that doesn't mean that the other things that are really important couldn't, in principle, be accommodated or be centered in, an objective function that AI might help us to solve for. And so I think one of the major actions that comes out from our conversation at our study workshop is that part where the problem is defined and where various possible ways of framing or defining the problem were sort of iterated over around a whiteboard really deserves to be seen as inside rather than outside of what it is that needs to be done in an intentional way, what it is that needs to be documented, what it is that needs to be made inclusive.
If I could ask a question, this is such a thrill for me because I've read the reports from both workshops actually several times, but I haven't had a chance to chat with you. I was just wondering if in either of the workshops there was any difference any significant difference between the perspective on this issue of integration versus deployment among academics versus the industry types. I could imagine that the industry people would be more focused on this because it's a make or break thing for them, but I also could imagine them ignoring it. So I don't know if there was any signal, and I was just wondering if there was a signal.
So I think in our workshop, with the startups, you could really feel that they're very much focused on deployment and not integration. And one thing that the workshop did for me is to make clear that this problem is not solved with more conversations. I like conversations. They often can have great outcomes, but there's a really structural problem in the care context, at least, and maybe also in the context that David at your workshop looked at. And that is, and we see this all over the tech sector. And this is the situation where we have a difference between the customers and the users. Right? We have that with social media. The customers are people who want to place ads, and the users are people like me, and probably you. And also with care, it's the same thing. The users are here, the people who are in need of care, but the customers are usually family members, right? So say I would pay someone for a home surveillance system for my aging parents to make sure they're safe. And so it's in a way my interests, because I'm the one who pays for it, that are represented, not so much my parents. So this is when user and customer kind of come apart, the market caters to the customer's interests, right? That's why we have terrible customer service, because we're just a user and not. Yeah, so I think that's, so Russ, I felt the startups weren't they saw the point, they found it an interesting conversation, but I don't think it would change anything for them, because for them, they're focused on the customer. And I think that's a structural problem.
I will add a note to that, just to put a little bit of texture on that division, which is that in a couple of cases, there was some pushback by the entrepreneurs who had done some kind of field research and who had, in fact, some academic background, in one case in human-robot interaction, where they did have some interesting insight into, for example, to pick up on this user-customer issue, the autonomy and agency that it gave some elderly interviewees who were given a domestic robot assistant, who enjoyed knowing how to use it in a way that their grandchildren did not. And so that it had a role that is not often scripted, in the case of, well, this robot will take care of this elderly person who won't have ability or autonomy or what have you. And in their research, they found, well, no, there's actually a complication there, because there's a sense of independence and ownership relative to loved ones who might be thought of as the overseeing caretaker, that there might be some more independence there. So I thought that was beneficial to at least create some complications in what kinds of assumptions can get rolling with the momentum around AI and robotics in terms of what's imagined. And I thought that was helpful.
And I will say one of my takeaways from your study workshop, Thomas and Johannes, were different moments where the entrepreneurs in the room didn't necessarily have, I won't necessarily say it's a luxury, but they hadn't had a chance to imagine the other kinds of customers to consider. And so, Russ, to your question, like I had moments where I could see their own, in some cases, discomfort of reckoning with prioritizing, say, the adult child of a parent who needed care, which could translate into surveillance, and the ethical conundrum of that, the tension of that, and not necessarily knowing how could they build out the customer base of the elderly person who needed tending and actually might want different features of interactivity to what Thomas was just describing. So it was hard not to feel like market forces short-circuiting the possibility of a much more robust, interesting set of applications of integration, as David was saying. David, I feel like I might have jumped in when you were about to say something.
Oh, well, I think, this distinction between users and customers applies in spades to the context we were looking at, which were generally public sector. And so you have vendors pitching something to a centralized bureaucracy, and then you have line level people sometimes using it, is what's typically the dynamic. But the other thing to say is we intentionally chose cases that we thought were atypical, in that the people who were building something had been particularly careful in the way that they'd gone about it, or particularly inviting of outside documentation and scrutiny. And so rather than being modal examples, these were particularly well understood examples. And I think that had, pros and cons. One of the pros is there was sort of a great spirit of curiosity and inquiry, and there was a lot of detail. One of the cons was I'm not sure at all that it gives us a sense of what's typically happening.
Well, so I'm hoping that we're going to use the second part of the roundtable to kind of go up one level and just think about the value of a study workshop and this kind of longitudinal approach to thinking about AI in society. But before I shift to putting more attention to Russ and Peter, I want to ask each of the representatives of the study workshops, could you just say one thing that you took away from that study workshop, really quite surprised by, that either left you a bit undone about what's going on with AI in society, and I'll just use that phrasing, or something that was heartening to you, and maybe I'll start with David, because you're right in my line of sight with my Zoom window.
I'll say that I was greatly heartened, and there are, of course, any number of reasons for concern. I was heartened by the level of care and intentionality, not to co-opt the focus of the other workshop, but the carefulness with which people were working in the cases that were the subject of our workshop. And in particular, I think everyone knows that AI involves technical innovation, but really what came to the fore for me and what we were doing was that there's tandem social innovation that is necessary, and that is, in at least some of these instances, taking place in a very careful way. And much as you would hope that an engineer or computer scientist would be careful and would be intentional in the way that they develop technical systems, what I saw was some real evidence that there are careful and intentional approaches that are, at least at a proof of concept level, it can be done, and in some instances it is being done, with respect to how do you, for instance, lead people to understand how a system works and lead them to appropriately rely on it and appropriately demur from it when they have expertise, apart from it. I think that is something that, in at least some of these discussions, has the dignity and stature kind of within our community of people trying to make AI do good in the world, that I think it needs.
Thank you. How about for Thomas and Johannes? Was there something that just really has stayed with you since the study workshop?
I mean, I think there are several things, but one that does stand out. There were a number of points during the workshop that I thought were productively surfaced conflict that sometimes can get papered over. But one caregiver gave a particularly bold statement about the issues of race and gender and social location that care occupies, and the inequality that really shoots through the enterprise in ways that in your normal academic conference, the way that those are put and argued about and conceptually analyzed often just tends to drive people into more analytic mode. But this was a personal, in the thick of it, testimony that I think really properly shook up the mode in which people were thinking, reflecting, feeling, and trying to be more generative and constructive about where to go from here. And certainly for me, working in a social robotics lab where we have projects that get down to the nitty-gritty of, say, how a robotic arm might feed someone, that was very useful in really trying to be generative along kind of feminist and sociological lines about all the different interests that could go into what might be thought of technically as a physical execution, rather than something that goes to dignity and the various interests as to that surround something as basic as feeding someone.
That's provocative, and I think I remember that moment. And I thank you for bringing that to mind. Johannes, how about for you? What has stayed with you since the study workshop?
My moment probably would be the same one that Thomas just brought back to memory. And that, I think, is something that is very hard for academics to stay faithful to integrate practitioners in their workshops, because that's something that's not classically done, and there's not a great amount of institutional understanding and support for doing that.
Can I actually press, I should say for our listeners that the study workshops themselves were what's called Chatham House rules. So we were not quoting directly from individuals at the study workshops to give people a lot of room to be able to talk about their experience. But could you be more specific about that practitioner point of view, and what difference did it make for them to speak to their very personal experience? Could you just say a little bit more to give people, I'm realizing like I know what you're talking about, but just share with us why that had such a lasting impact? What it was.
I mean, for me, so I come from philosophy. For me, I had lasting impacts, not just by talking to practitioners, but also talking to people who are more in the empirical sciences. And I think there's already a problematic disconnect between my discipline. We might have great normative vocabulary and might help articulate ethical problems clearly, but we have hardly any empirical understanding. So one gap that we bridged was with people from science and technology studies. Well, that's inter-academic. The one that really stuck with me was that we had a caregiver, and I think her background was Hispanic, and she had organized for union work on the West Coast for caregivers. And just the struggles that she goes through and the ongoing negotiations that she has to engage in were really fascinating. So these are negotiations on the one hand with the customer, and on the other hand also with the person they are caring for. So there's a constant negotiation of terms and boundaries and expectations. And that was just so refreshing from an intellectual point of view, because between philosophers and social scientists, we can talk a long time about the concept of care. And it turned out, whereas we thought this will be an important part because this is what the literature is about, it didn't really matter so much. I think we found so much common ground when we were discussing particular issues, and they were really raised by having a person in the room who has given care for decades and fought for caregivers' political interests for a long time.
Yeah, no, and I feel like it resonated. My experience of being part of the other study workshop with David, those moments when someone was talking about the work and what kind of work people were trying to achieve, that was often about meeting someone's need, and how AI was a part of, but certainly not driving what those human interactions look like. It took all of the theory off the drafting table and I think put it in front of all of us to see the very human engagement that happens, not just around the edges, but in the thick of things. So let me shift now to Peter and Russ, and by all means, please, I invite all the panelists to jump in if you have thoughts on this. But I wanted to ask in turn, Peter and Russ, to just talk a little bit about their sense of the value, the use of something like AI 100 as an approach for thinking about the relationship between AI, society, and really AI placed in the public domain, whether it's for distributing information or making sure buses show up where they're needed, or being able to route care to patients in need. So let me start with you, Peter. If you could just say a little bit about, particularly from your perspective as chairing the standing committee, but also your past experience as chair of the study panel.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. So I mean, first of all, I think the workshops and the discussion that we just heard is fascinating, and to me, it's striking, how timely and relevant those conversations feel right now, and yet, you look back to when the concept of the AI 100 study, when it was conceived, which is about 13 years ago or so, and then when it was launched, just 6 or 7 years ago. These kinds of conversations would have felt much more futuristic and maybe interesting, but not quite relevant, because AI wasn't really sort of in the public sphere as much. And we know from the history of artificial intelligence that there are there's cycles. There's times when it's very much sort of hyped up in everybody's consciousness, and there's times when the AI winters, when everybody knows it's a failure and it's it never didn't live up to its promises. And I think the beauty of the 100-year study, and the way it was conceived by originally by Eric Horvitz and is that we want to be able to sort of take this longitudinal periodic view of how AI is viewed by society, interacts with society, what the realistic hopes and concerns are, as opposed to the extreme, either it's the utopian perspective of AI or the dystopian perspective. And I think to really have that realism, it sort of requires the kinds of thought and experiences that we just heard about and the workshops. And so the purpose of AI 100 in commissioning these workshops was to sort of provide some deep thought on a few topics that are very relevant and topical today, and that will go in and sort of inform the upcoming study panel report. The new study panel report will incorporate some of these issues and also many more. But I think, it's even in the time between the launch of the study and the first study panel report, as we all know, that was a time of real boom and hype for AI. And I think it's sort of in the years since then has matured to a point where we are, it makes sense to have these conversations with practitioners, with and to think about what are the real implications of deploying AI technologies and AI systems in situations with care and caregiving, and situations of prediction in sort of courtrooms and other kind of legal settings. It's now to the point where it's really important and essential for all AI researchers to be aware of the implications of these systems can have, and to think about these deeply. And so to me, it's heartening. It's heartening that these conversations do feel important and relevant in a way that when I started working on AI, they really didn't.
And I'm struck, and I'll just point out to folks who have joined us today that this panel really reflects the breadth and depth of different perspectives that have been brought to this study, this approach. So we have legal scholar, philosophers, humanists. I'm an anthropologist by training, and foundational computer scientists who are thinking through these problems, and rather than thinking this is a technical question, really seeing how deeply socio-technical, to use a phrase that's become quite mainstream, how much of this conversation is now a convening of these different perspectives as we're learning each other's languages, which I feel is probably one of the greatest challenges, is being able to understand each other. So Russ, particularly from your position as the faculty advisor, can you just, faculty director rather, of the AI 100 study, can you give us your take on what is the purpose, the particular value of having a study, having a 100-year scoped study to these questions, these conversations?
Yes, thank you. So just for people, for background, my role on the AI 100 is the Stanford Faculty Director, which is basically a liaison. In a very narrow sense, I have two jobs: to make sure that the endowment is spent in pursuit of the goals of the charter of the endowment. So just make sure we obey the rules and do what the endowment says. And secondly, really just to make sure that the deliberations of this, both the standing committee and the study panel, are consistent with whatever Stanford rules of appropriate, decorum and behavior. And so that's very narrow. But really, so let's put that aside. It's been such a pleasure because I'm the founding faculty director. So I got to watch the first report that Peter led, and now this one, and as well as the workshops. And the first thing I'll say about the AI 100 that I think is obvious is, at a 5-year pace, there's a chance for some deliberation and not having stimulus response type discussions and deliberations. So it really is a very deliberate, long time frame, especially by any measure of current communications and progress. And so that means that people can really take time to think about what they're doing and be very thoughtful. And I think the best example is after the first study panel, which was great, the standing committee, which by the way is a self-perpetuating committee. So I just watch, I don't set that committee. And it's been nothing but a pleasure, because one of the things that they decided, two things I want to highlight. They decided that it would be very important, just as Mary said, to make sure that it was not just technologists, but humanists, social scientists. And that right away set the entire temperature and flavor of the committee in a very positive way, very consistent with, I think, lots of interest in human-centered AI. By the way, I'm also an associate director of the Stanford Center for Human-Centered AI, in which this is loosely housed, at least the money. So that decision by the standing committee was critical. The other really big decision was, in addition to just looking at the world and creating a report, maybe we should, they said to themselves, create some new content. And that new content was this call for proposals for workshops, a very rigorous, I think we can't stress enough that there was many good proposals, and these two just really rose up as two very exciting ones. And this was a way to create novel content that would just kind of nudge the next study panel, the one that's sitting now, to think about these issues, prediction and caring, in addition to all the other things they want to think about. And I thought that was extremely wise, as well as a way to not only be reacting to the world, but also making these contributions to the world as part of the work of the study panel. So those things I think are emblematic, Mary, of the kinds of ways the Standing Committee and the AI 100 in general have evolved, that makes me think that we're going to have another good 90 years. And by the way, 100 is a nice number for a title, but I think there's a full expectation that this might go on forever.
I hope so, and I hope we've figured out how to keep us around longer. Speaking of which, this hour has gone quickly. I hope you all have enjoyed it as much as I have. But we have a little bit of time left for some Q&A. And I had a question for the panel, but I actually see that there's a question someone's asked from the audience. So I'm going to go to that question first. The question from the audience is, to what extent do we imagine that prediction errors can be accepted? And I'm just struck by that question, because I feel like the study panelists, if you'd have just take a shot at answering, how did people grapple with error in prediction in the settings that you were discussing? Let me go to David first, because that came up quite a bit in your study panel.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is yes, that inevitably there are errors, and that's, I think, recognizing that as part of aligning expectations with reality, which has been a tacit theme of our hour.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there's at times an uncomfortable level of explicitness that's created by the shift from more humane modalities or more interpersonal modalities of judgment into something that's more quantified or more automated. And I really, I think that at times that can force an uncomfortable shift. I think at its best, it can stimulate productive conversations, but it's definitely tricky to navigate.
And how about for Johannes and for Thomas, just the conversation around errors and what constitutes an acceptable error? I also remember coming up quite a bit.
Yeah, we did have conversations that were really about the data, what data would constitute, what sufficient data would mean, and to what degree I know that there were conversations during the kind of innovation fair around what kind of product would be able to achieve acceptable prediction. I would say that I think in our workshop, and Johannes might be able to kind of temper my comments here, but it seemed to me that we really did pan back a bit to ask how much data itself would really be the driving force when we start talking about defining AI, rather than taking one step back and thinking about, for example, norms in natural language and other things where you're going to be working with people who are reasoning, who are thinking symbolically, thinking causally, thinking counterfactually. In those cases, prediction may not be the chief mode by which we evaluate care. So I would flag that as in terms of how AI has been in many cases so data-driven and so geared toward that framework. In care, it seems to me to be a little bit of a different scenario. But Johannes.
No, I totally agree. I mean, take the example of a chatbot, right? That is in a way also a caring technology if it's a chatbot that is meant to be your digital personal psychologist. And you don't need bleeding edge natural language technology to give the people already a feeling that they're being listened to. And you very quickly can put them in a vulnerable situation. So in a way, I find this scary, right? That in care, it doesn't take high-end technology that we probably do have or might have in a few years or decades to already raise hard issues and high-stakes issues.
I think what I appreciated most from the study workshops was that it really, in some ways, reframed the question so that it became less of an obsession with really hitting a particular benchmark in prediction and becoming error-free and being much more reflective in the hope of identifying sooner and iterating on what are we trying to achieve. Again, back to that conversation of optimizing. It's really calling us all to rethink a kind of flat sense of prediction as one thing, and constantly using AI to help us to surface what are the assumptions we're making about what is a win and what is a loss. I definitely I was going to say, I don't want the final word, please.
I was just going to, well, I don't want this to be the final word necessarily, but I would just interject briefly that I think it is important to recognize that prediction systems, it's sort of harmful or dangerous to have the standard be perfection. Really, the standard should be the alternatives, right? And in many cases, AI technologies are being, are sort of, should be juxtaposed against the alternative of all human, system, which also is not perfect. And I think the complementarities, having people, the general public, understand and grow in acceptance of the fallibility of AI technologies in the same way that people accept human error, and maybe start to get a feel for and comfort with the idea that if you put the systems together, the errors can the errors and the strengths can complement one another and lead to a better overall deployment or integration, as we've been saying.
That is the perfect note to end on. And we're actually over time, so I want to thank everybody, particularly our panelists, for coming together today, depending on where you are, what time of day it might be. And if we were together, I'd be giving you a round of applause. I find Zoom's clapping a little odd, but I'm going to do it. So thank you very much.